Colum carried the heavy chest up the hill, cradling it at his belly with both arms. Its iron padlock banged against the latch with each step. His worn boots slipped on the grass against the steep incline, and the permanent rain soaked through the shoulders of his wool coat. The sky was a steel blanket that hung heavy and low over the treeless, dark green hills. Wind blew rain on his face, and water streamed down his cheeks like tears. He lost his footing and fell upward, landing on his side. The chest slipped from his fingers. It tumbled soundlessly down the hill until it dropped into the stream at the bottom with a splash. Colum stood and put his hands on his waist, panting. He stared to the top of the hill, then back down to the bottom. His forehead throbbed with wordless frustration and despair and defeat. He squeezed his eyes shut and pressed his tongue against his hard palate. Colum counted up to 10, then back to 1. He opened his eyes and slowly made his way down to the stream. The giant stood on the perimeter of the muddy clearing at the top of the hill, with his arms crossed, staring out into nothing. He wore a tight brown suit with red patches at his elbows and yellow patches at his knees, where they had been extended with extra fabric to fit him. Still, the cloth hardly made it to his wrists and ankles. The rain soaked through a yellow sweat stain on the collar of his dirty shirt. Water poured down his face into two small, dark eyes that were set too closely together, above a button nose that disappeared into his steaming, wild beard. A huge, zipped leather satchel sat in the mud at his feet. Colum dropped the trunk in the center of the clearing. The iron lock clanged against the brass latch, snapping the giant out of his daydream. Colum bent over with his hands on his thighs, catching his breath.
"Christ, didn't see you there,"
said the giant. The giant rubbed his nose on his coat sleeve and inspected the streak of snot.
"Was lost in the thoughts like. That ever happened to you?" All you ever say,
The giant spat, but it got caught in his beard. Spittle clung to his chin before the rain washed it away. Colum let out an exhausted sigh. "What were you thinking about?" said Colum.
Oh?
"You said you were lost in your thoughts."
Oh, nothing. I don't really ever think about nothing."
Colum nodded and wiped the rain from his eyes. "Can we get started?" The giant frowned.
"Why can't we ever have a chat like?"
"What would you like to have a chat about?" The giant squinted his eyes.
I don't know, we could, talk about the weather."
"It's always raining. It's always cold. What else would you like me to say?" The giant's eyes went wide, as if this was the first time he had ever considered rain.
"It is always raining like."
Colum wiped the water from his forehead. The giant looked up to the sky. "Can we get started?"
Aye.
The giant reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a document. He unfolded the paper. It sagged in the rain. He read aloud, slowly. Pursuant.
Oh, pursuant. I always forget that one. Pursuant to the terms set by the
The giant hung his head and sighed.
Can you read it for me, please?
Colum nodded and took it from his hands. Pursuant to the terms set by the magistrate, if the plaintiff, Colum Carmody, henceforth referred to as plaintiff, can access passport documents found in the trunk with the tools provided daily by the state, the plaintiff is free to leave the island on the condition the plaintiff never returns. A new tool will be provided every day by the state, and that tool alone shall be used to break the lock. The plaintiff shall carry the trunk up the hill at daybreak and work until sunset, at which point the plaintiff will carry the box back down the hill and leave it at rest, not to touch it until the following day. A new proclamation with the same terms shall be provided to and read by the guardian every morning. Colum folded the paper back up.
Is that it?
Said the giant. That's it. Same as yesterday.
Are you the guardian or am I?
You're the guardian.
Right. Wait. Am I going to get in trouble for not reading it, like?
I won't tell. The giant sighed with relief.
Oh, thanks.
Colum stood staring at the giant. What have you got for me today? Said Colum.
Huh?
To break the lock.
Oh, let's take a look.
The giant opened the satchel at his feet and snorted.
Oh boy, you're not gonna like this.
Colum clenched his teeth. The giant pulled an old broom out of the bag. It was crooked and knotted at the handle. A badly rusted tin coil held the wild, worn straw bristles in place. Colum took the broom in his bruised hands and stared at it. Fucking Christ, he whispered.
Wish I could help, but the rules are the rules. They don't make it easy, do they?
Colum carried the broom to the trunk and speared the handle against the lock. It slipped in his hands. He continued jamming the broom relentlessly against the lock at a metronomic pace, opening the blisters on his palms. The wood began to splinter, neither did he dent the lock. Rain seeped into the shackle, and chestnut water dripped out of the keyhole.
Oh, it's getting dark, like,
said the giant. Colum sat in the mud, weakly slapping the straw against the lock. The giant walked over to Colum and held out his hand. Colum got up on his own and handed the giant the broom. The giant put the broom in the satchel, zipped it, and slung it over his shoulder. Colum stretched his hands. The blood on his palms turned pink in the rain, and it ran down his wrists and gathered at his elbows inside his coat. He went to the trunk and took it by the handles.
Can I ask you something?
Said the giant. Colum stood up. Uh-huh.
What's making you want to leave so bad, like?
Now you ask.
Why? Oh, is this a bedtime? I'm sorry.
No. We've done this every day for over 3 months, and you never thought to ask me once, why? The giant pursed his lips and tugged at his beard like he was trying to solve a math problem.
I suppose it didn't occur to me till right now.
It didn't occur to you.
Aye.
Colum wiped away the water pooling under his nose. I'm going somewhere new, and I'm keeping my mouth shut. The giant shrugged.
You don't need to go someplace else to keep your mouth shut.
The wind picked up, blowing the giant's beard over his shoulder. Do you know what I do? Asked Colum.
Yeah, you try to break a box open every day like a fucking madman.
Colum smirked. I'm a painter, said Colum.
Oh, so you paint houses, like?
Not houses.
Oh, pictures?
Sure, pictures. But for the state.
Well, that sounds just fine. And at least it's not in the rain.
It's not fine. I'm only allowed to paint portraits of powerful men, or murals of things that never happened, of things that people want to see, but they have no truth. The giant squinted.
What's a mural?
A mural is like a picture that tells a story. The giant looked even more confused. The state won't let me paint anything else, so I can't paint for myself, and it's turned my heart very cold. I see paintbrushes, and I see labor. I see color, and it's all gray. I see a blank canvas or a blank wall, and all I can think of is the time that I've been given that's been wasted in service of someone else. And they won't let me leave unless I break open this box and get what's rightfully mine. The giant spat. Wind blew the spit onto his face and up his ear.
Well, why don't they just tell you to fuck off?
Because on this island, art is a commodity. It's bought or it's sold or it's used to an unintended end of the creator for someone else's benefit.
Where'd you learn all these godforsaken words, like?
When I go somewhere new, I'm keeping my mouth shut. I'll work in a factory. I'll shovel coal. At night, when I'm all alone, I'm going to paint by the fire. Whatever I want. Then, before the sun comes up, I'm going to take my painting off the easel, look at it one last time, and throw it in the fire. And the painting will become smoke, and the smoke will creep out of the chimney and disappear in the sky.
But no one will ever see it.
I will. Colum grabbed the trunk with one hand and dragged it through the mud. He brought it to the edge of the clearing, then pushed it with the heel of his boot, and it rolled down the hill. The lock clanged against the box until it landed in the stream below. Colum made his way down the hill, skidding, landing on his ass and pushing himself back up with wet hands that slipped against the grass. When he got to the bottom, he watched the water flow over and around the trunk. The lock was submerged and floated in place against the weak current. He debated wading into the water to pull it back out, but was too exhausted. He left it where it was and walked an hour home in the rain. Waves lapped against the hull as the rowboat rocked in the darkness. The night sky was painted in violet light. Colum sat in the middle of the sole thwart. The boat was too wide and too long, but it was short, with the water just inches below the gunwale. The oars creaked in the rusted iron crutches, and he could only reach one at a time, nor could he handle an oar while manning the tiller. He attempted to row, but only went in circles until he gave up and laid on his back lengthwise across the thwart. Colum stared at the starless sky until he felt a strange presence join him on the boat. He sat up, and resting on the bow was an enormous mute swan. It observed him curiously with its dead black eyes, then slowly extended its wings, which spanned over both sides of the boat. Two more mute swans landed soundlessly on the port and starboard sides of the rowboat. The swan on the bow closed its wings, and the birds flanking Colum began pecking at the rusted crutches. The iron crumbled without resisting, and the oars teetered off the side of the boat. At once, the birds took off and silently flew off into the darkness. Colum scrambled to save an oar, but it fell into the water. He bent over the side of the boat and reached into the cold depths, but it was already gone. Colum hung there for a moment with his arms submerged, until he pushed himself up with one hand on the gunwale and the other on what remained of the rusted clutch. The clutch quickly crumbled into red dust that stained his palm. Colum sat on the thwart and brought his hand to his face. It had a stinging metallic scent. He licked his finger and tasted iron. The corroded metal was gritty between his teeth. He crouched as he walked to the stern and clutched the tiller. He shook it back and forth in an attempt to propel the rudder like a fish, but it only made waves. Colum ran his tongue over his teeth and spat the sandy saliva onto the gunwale. It began to bubble and burned a hole through the wood like acid until it dissolved it straight through. He licked the rust on his finger and rubbed his finger against his thumb until it made a corrosive paste and slid his finger across the thwart. It too burned a hole. He stared at his hand and then he woke up. The sun was not yet up when Colum waded into the water to retrieve the trunk. It had sunk into the silt overnight, and he pulled it until it made a sucking sound, and he wiggled it free. Colum pulled it to the bank and sat to rest. He lazily took the lock in his hand and shook the water out of it. Rufous water leaked from the keyhole in the heel and toe of the shackle. He wiped it away and it stained his fingers red. He rubbed his hands on his coat and that it stained too. Colum licked the tip of his finger, and it had a bitter, metallic taste. A warm sensation expanded in his belly and rose to his throat like a ball of light. He shut his eyes and counted to 10, then carried the trunk up the hill to the clearing where the giant was waiting for him, his arms crossed, staring at the sky. "Morning," said Colum. The giant kept his eyes on the sky. Raindrops streamed down the side of his face and disappeared into his beard.
I was thinking about what you said yesterday.
About what? Painting? The giant shook his head.
No, the rain.
Ah,
Ever since you mentioned it, it's all I can think about. I think I'm getting tired of being soggy all the time. You poisoned my mind, like.
I'm sorry.
I usually don't think of much, but now it's buzzing in me head.
Why don't you think about something else?
Like what?
Think about how nice it is to have a job. The giant sucked on his lips and nodded.
Why, that's a nice thought. Working is nice. You know what to expect every day. No surprises. I'm lucky I have a job.
You are. Can we get started then?
Aye.
The giant reached into his coat and pulled out the Daily Proclamation. Would you like me to read it again? Asked Colum.
Oh, that'd be grand.
Colum read the proclamation and handed back the paper. The giant crouched down and unzipped the satchel.
Fucking hell.
Said the giant. He pulled out a thick leather razor strap. Colum politely smiled and took it from him. He put the strap over his shoulder, walked to the trunk, and set the trunk on its back. He held the lock skyward, and the rain seeped into the keyhole, and light brown water dripped out of the shank. The giant looked at him curiously.
Aren't you gonna whack it with this strop?
This will work fine. The giant scratched his beard, then looked back at the sky.
Bleeding rain.
Said the giant. Think of something else.
I can't think all day like you. It makes my head hurt. Do you think people think all day?
I believe very few people think about anything. People only want to feel good and stay entertained.
Oh, that's a relief. I just like to keep my hands busy and I'm happy enough.
Here. Colum picked up the leather strap from the mud and handed it to the giant, like offering a child a toy. Maybe this can keep you busy. The giant tugged on the leather and pushed it in like an accordion. He brought it to his mouth and sucked his teeth in.
Tastes kinda sweet like. Smells good too. You don't mind if I hold on to this, do ya?
Not at all. The giant played with the strap. Colum sat back down in the mud and held the padlock to the rein.
You know, you're not such a bad guy,
said the giant. Thanks. The giant put the strap in his mouth, covering it in thick slobber.
But your problem is, you think too much.
Is that it?
What are you thinking about now? Painting?
Colum chewed his cheek. I'm not really thinking about anything. The giant smiled.
That's the lad.
He bit the strap again and studied the teeth marks. When they finished for the day, Colum left the trunk in the stream, then walked home in the rain. Neither did he dream. Colum held the padlock to the rein. He sniffed the keyhole and was met with the stinging metallic scent of ferric corrosion. It smelled like blood. He brought his ear to the lock and shook it. Pieces were coming loose on the inside and the latch was starting to give. His fingers pruned with weeping sores from months of sitting in the rain, waiting for the lock's internal components to dissolve and give way. His fingernails were loose and some had fallen off. The skin on the bottom of his legs and his ass rubbed away from sitting in the mud. The giant gazed across the horizon.
You know what kind of paintings I like?
Asked the giant.
I like paintings that look like the things they're supposed to be. A painting of a woman should look like a woman. A cat should look like a cat. You don't need to make it complicated, like. People won't like it.
All right.
When you go free, What are you gonna paint?
Asked the giant. The kind of paintings you don't like. The giant frowned.
Don't you care what people like?
Not really. No.
Well, why not?
Colum sighed. Because I don't like most people. The giant gasped. He got quiet and pouted his lower lip. He sniffed and wiped a tear from his cheek. You all right? Asked Colum. The giant swallowed.
Why, it'd break my heart if you didn't like me. I was beginning to think we're friends.
Colum looked at him and smiled. I like you.
Why?
You're kind. You're nice. You're funny. The giant wiped away another tear and smiled.
Don't you think most people are kind, though?
No.
How's that?
I think you're thinking too much. The giant laughed.
Now that's fucking funny. You know, you're funny. A miserable fuck you are, but you're funny like.
A silence hung between them. The rain poured.
I'm glad we're friends,
said the giant. Me too, said Colum.
Do you think you'd ever paint a picture of me?
If you'd like, I can.
Oh, I'd like that very much. It'd have to look like me, though. Is that all right?
Yes, that's all right. The giant smiled.
Well, I'm glad we're friends. It's nice to have friends.
Colum nodded. Rusty water ran down his palms and forearm and collected at his elbows beneath his coat. The weather got colder and the mud froze. Still, Colum held on to the padlock. He began to doze when he shivered and awoke with a jerk. He clenched his fist and inadvertently pulled forward. The latch snapped off the lock, and the body split, and rusted components bounced on the frozen ground. Colum stared at his hand. He let the pieces fall through his fingers.
Oh, you alright?
Asked the giant. Colum turned with his eyes wide and presented the disintegrated lock.
Oh,
said the giant, mystified. Colum stood up and wiped his hands on the front of his coat. Well, that's that, said Colum. He put his hands on his hips and stared at the box.
Well, aren't you gonna open it?
I think I might. Colum bent on his knee and opened the box. Inside was another box, steel, with no signs of wear short of a few stains where water crept in. On the box, in capital letters, was engraved, Colum Carmody, passport documents, and travel voucher. He ran his fingers over the letters to make sure it was real.
Well, open it like,
said the giant. Stand over me and block the rain. I don't want it to get wet. The giant towered over him. Colum lifted the steel box and shook it. The documents rustled inside. He felt around the box to find a hinge, but there was none. He brought the box to his eyes to examine it. Beneath the lip of the box, a thin line of welding sealed it shut. Colum's mind went blank. Minutes passed in silence. If the giant spoke, Colum didn't hear him. He bit his tongue until it bled, and it tasted like iron. He carefully put the steel box in the trunk and closed the trunk. He stood up and looked over the hills. Wind carried torrents of rain that changed direction like schools of fish. He walked out of the clearing and started down the hill. The giant shouted down at him.
Hey, where are you going?
Colum stopped, then turned around and looked up the hill. I'm going to work, said Colum. The giant shook his head in disbelief and raised his hands in the air. Colum started down the hill.
It's not fair!
called the giant. Colum nodded and headed towards the stream.
Let me help! I thought we were friends!
Colum crossed the stream and began the hour walk home in the freezing rain, leaving the giant at the top of the hill. Colum got home and put a fire on. He got out of his wet clothes and hung them over the mantel to dry. Colum changed into dry clothes, put on his wet boots, went out the front door and back into the rain. Then he began the 2-hour walk to the village, where he would report to work.